Okay, so we left the last lesson. We'd actually created our database called company. We created a table and we'd actually populated that with some users by using generatedata.com. Now, as I said, the reason for doing that is we just want to have that quick win. We want to test everything, make sure we're on the right lines, that everything's working, and then we can progress in a little bit more detail throughout the rest of the course. So with that in mind, the next thing is to actually retrieve the data from the database by using the front end. So what I want you to do is go to section 1, right click and create a new file, and we'll just call this quick win. So quick-win, and .php is the extension on the end. And there's my quick win file. So I'm going to open a PHP code block, so PHP. Now I want to start to connect to the database and then retrieve those records. So there's a few variables I need to declare first. Now the first one is the database host. So db host equals. Now this is the location of the database itself, and it's actually on the local host. You can also put an IP address in there. So localhost. The next thing we need to do is to provide the name of the actual database itself, so the database name. And the database was called company. The next thing we'll require is the username and password to actually access the database. So we'll need a db username. And if you recall, the username was root. And the database password, well, it was actually just blank. Now these variables I've actually created, you can call these anything you wish, but it does make sense to actually use a name that actually makes sense. And to me, this does make sense. Now the next thing I need to create is the data source name. And if you've been playing around with PDO, you might have actually seen that around, our DSN. So the DSN, the data source name, is going to be equal to the following. Now we are using MySQL, so MySQL is the driver. And the host, well, that is equal to the database host. So db_host. Then we use a semicolon. And then we need the database name, which is equal to, well, dbName. So db_name. And then we can actually use a semicolon to finish that line. So that's our DSN taken care of. Now the next thing I want to do is to actually create the database connection. So the database connection, and again, I'm using a variable name that I'm making up, so db_connection. That's equal to a new PDO. So that's a class, it's an inbuilt class. And we can actually pass in some parameters. Now we're going to use 3 parameters here. The first being the DSN, the data name source. The second being the username. And the third being the password. So the first one is the DSN. The second one is the username, which we've got as db username. And the third is the password, so that is db password. And finish with a semicolon. So what that line is going to do is going to create a new PDO connection using these parameters here. And it's going to store it in db connection. So that's going to be an object that I can then use. Now the next thing I want to do is to actually create a query. And this query is so I can pull the records from the database. So I'm going to use a variable called query. Again, you can call it anything you wish. And my query is going to be a SQL command in here. Now what I want to do is I want to select, so in capital letters, it doesn't have to be capital, but I like to put mine in capitals. So select all the records, and we use that with a star. So the star means select all from. Now where are we selecting them from? Well, we're selecting them from the database table, which is called users. Now this line here is not actually doing anything yet. What I'm actually doing is I'm just storing this query, select star from users, into this little variable here. What I then need to do is actually run that query. And the way I do this is I say db_connection. So I'm using that object. We're going to operate on the object and we're going to run a query. Now that's an inbuilt function, or a method I should say. So we're going to run a query, and the parameter we're going to pass is what we've just written above. It's the actual query. Now we're going to get some results from that, and the results I want to store in results. So results is equal to, take our object, we're going to run a query on it. What query are we running? We are running this query here. Select star from users. Now what we're going to do next is we're actually going to close the database connection. So the database connection, we are going to say equal to null. And it's a good habit to get into that practice of opening and closing your database connections. Now we're going to assume that we did retrieve some records from the database, and now we want to actually loop through those records. So if you notice, if you're familiar with PHP, I haven't done any sort of error trapping at all at this stage. We're keeping things very, very simple. We will progress later on through the course and look at some sort of try-catch block. But for the time being, let's just keep things nice and simple. So I'm going to assume that I do have a set of results here. So results, and what I want to do next is to actually loop through those results. Now I'm going to use a for each loop. So for each something, I'm going to do something. Now if you're familiar with my last course, we've been through that many times, and you should be familiar with it. Now in these round brackets, I want to say, well, I'm going to take the whole results set, and for each one, I want to store it in result. And then in the curly braces, this is what I want to do for each one. I want to echo, so I'm going to take the result, and in square brackets and some tick marks, I'm going to choose the actual column in my database. So we've got first name, surname, we've got date of birth, and we've got email. And which one do I actually want to show? Well, I actually want to show the first name. Now, as I'm going to be looping through these, I do also want to echo out a little break. So I'll put in a little break here and a semicolon. Now I'll save that. So Command or Control S. Go over to my section 1. There is the quick win rather. Click on there, and there we see a full list of all the first names. If I wanted to retrieve the email, I'll change first name to email, save, go back, and refresh. Now hopefully that worked for you as well. As I said, this is a quick win section. We're going through things in very basic detail here. We're just using code. You might not understand it. You might have made one or two errors with commas and semicolons, etc. But if you have, go back to lesson 1, watch the first video, watch the second video, make sure you use exactly the same names I have, and this code should work. Now, if you find that things just aren't working for you, I've actually attached this code into the resources section as a little text file. Download the text file, copy the code, and paste it in. If you're still having issues, then obviously there is the Q&A section, and you can also send me a private message. Now moving on to section 2, we're going to go into a lot more detail in phpMyAdmin. We're going to be uploading some CSV files, we're going to be manually creating database tables, and actually populating records, making changes, etc.